All right, welcome everybody. My name is Kevin. I'm the training coordinator with the Association of State Floodplain Managers, and I'd like to welcome you to our presentation of the Cooperating Technical Partners Quarterly Information Exchange webinar series here. And so today we're going to be talking about hazard mitigation and floodplain management planning. But before we get into this topic, I just have a few administrative announcements to get through with you all, so we can kind of set the stage for our topic today. Um, and so first things first, I just want to mention, we've got a very large group joining us today. And to that end, all of the phone lines and everything are going to be muted. So if you have any questions or any comments on anything you see today, we definitely want to hear your feedback and we want you to weigh in. So there's a Q&A feature here in Zoom. So just go ahead and type any of your questions or comments there. And there will be a dedicated Q&A period at the end. So if you ask a question early on and you don't hear us going over it right away, don't worry. We're going to try to answer as many questions as we can kind of as time allows toward the end of this presentation. But just want to let you know you're going to have to type out your questions and comments and submit them via the Q&A there. Couple other things I want to mention. Number one, we are recording this, and so we do make these recordings available after the fact. If we're moving too quickly, you're trying to take notes, or you just need to reference this later on for whatever reason, we are going to have that recording available to you. Another thing I want to talk about are continuing education credits. This event is approved for CECs for CFMs, and also AICPs can get credit for this as well. So that's in the system. I can't remember what APA system is called, but it's in the system. You can find it, and if not, when we distribute the follow-up materials from this, I'll include the number that you can use to reference that for your AICP as well. So just wanted to let you know that that credits are available. But if you're in a group setting, like if you're watching this with 10 coworkers in a conference room or whatever, it's not eligible for credit that way, unfortunately. A couple other additional logistics to get through. Like I said, there's a quarterly webinar series. So if you have something you think might be a good idea for this, we're always looking for new topics. So as you can see on the screen there, Alan Luloff is the lead on this. And if you would like to reach out to Alan, his email address is on the screen there. Let him know what kind of topics you have in mind that you already know of, or just something you might like to hear more about or learn more about. That's also valuable. A couple of notes on CECs for CFMs. Will apply the credit to your records automatically if you're a national level CFM. So you do not need to like submit for credit after the fact. However, that can sometimes be an imperfect system, or there's just questions about how that works. So we're also going to be sending all attendees today a certificate of attendance saying, hey, you attended. Here's your certificate of completion with that, with your name on it. However, it takes us about a week to turn that around. So you'll be in about a week or so receiving an email from us with your certificate of attendance if you earn one, and links to some of the other materials, whether that's slides or recording or anything else discussed today. So just want to kind of set everybody's expectations there. Last thing I want to get into before we start talking about this project and then specifically about the topic at hand today is we'll be having some poll questions today, so please be ready for those. I know a lot of you are probably familiar with that, but we're just going to be asking you some questions about your experience with some of this stuff, so please go ahead and weigh in on those polls. But with that, I've gone on certainly more than long enough, so I'll introduce Alan Luloff. Alan's with the ASFPM Flood Science Center. And he can tell us a little bit more about the CTP subcommittee and some more about the presentation and speakers today. So Alan, take it away.
Hello. Yes, ASFPM is a strong supporter of the Cooperating Technical Partners Program, and our board of directors actually passed a board resolution a number of years ago in support of it. And at that time created a subcommittee of the ASFPM Mapping and Engineering Standards Committee. And that subcommittee is co-chaired by Joanna Rolfe with Kansas Department of Agriculture and Dave Gannett. the Maryland Department of the Environment. And you can see the goals that are associated with the subcommittee. And one of the major things that we do, of course, in this is put on quarterly webinars. And today's presentation is one of those events. We're fortunate to have strong attendance to these, and today is no exception to that. So for today's agenda, it's going to be, we're going to start with the mitigation planning overview and how the CRS updates support leveraging mitigation planning for CRS participation. Next, we'll discuss mitigation planning at the local, regional level with the perspectives from coastal Virginia. Next, it'd be advancing planning integration at the local and state level. And there'll be a City of Tulsa case study, and then we'll have a session for questions and discussion. And again, please type your questions into the question box, and we'll, when we have time at the end, we'll read those questions off to be shared with, answered by the group. Kevin, I don't see the listing of speakers.
We don't have a slide for that.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Well then, yeah, the first speaker will be Shubha Shrivastava. I knew I'd get it wrong. Shrivastava. Shubha works with the FEMA headquarters at the National Mitigation Planning Program, and she's currently leading capacity building for long-term resilience planning through policy training and technical assistance to states and local governments. Next, we will have Mary Carson Stiff. Mary Carson is an executive director of Wetlands Watch, a Norfolk-based Virginia nonprofit working statewide to conserve nature in a changing climate. Mary Carson leads Wetland Watch with a specific focus on climate change adaptation planning, floodplain management, wetlands migration, and policy. Then we'll have Savannah Newbern, who is flood risk manager for Wetlands Watch. She's a coastal planning enthusiast who previously worked in local government on the Outer Banks of North Carolina for Dare and Kern-Tuck counties. And then finally, we'll have Shanine Thomas, and she's a hazard mitigation planner at FEMA Region 6 with over 18 years of emergency management experience in both federal and state government. She reviews local, state, and tribal mitigation plans, provides technical assistance for all hazard planning efforts, primarily in Oklahoma and New Mexico. She also instructs EMI courses and involved in multiple efforts to improve emergency management across various disciplines. So that's our speaker today. We've got a nice group of speakers. So thank you very much for attending, and you can now take it away.
Great. Thank you, Alan. And with that, I think we have our first poll. Hello, welcome everyone. And we have our poll so we can get to know you better as the audience.
Yeah, thanks, Shubha. So while you're getting set up and kind of settled in there, if everyone just wants to take a moment to respond to the poll, if you've been involved in hazard mitigation or floodplain management planning, what was your role? So not necessarily right or wrong answer, obviously, but we're just sort of interested in taking the temperature of the audience here. And to that end, I'm going to allow for maybe 20 more seconds or so, and then we'll all take a look at the results.
Right, do you all see my screen?
Yes, looks great.
Okay, thank you. So, I saw the greatest majority of the audience is floodplain managers, so that's great. But there's a good mix of emergency managers as well. And so today we're talking about these two planning processes, and we're going to discuss the why and the how of integrating these planning processes to your benefit, whether you're state or local or tribe. And then we think there is a lot of benefit in integrating these processes. You can strengthen your flood mitigation efforts and get a discount on flood insurance premiums. So it's really a win-win to integrate these two processes. I'll go over the why from a national perspective, and my co-presenters will go into more details of the how based on their local and regional expertise. I think with that, let's go one by one, as you may already be familiar, but as a quick overview, hazard mitigation planning reduces loss of life and property by minimizing the impact of disasters. So it begins with state, tribal, and local governments identifying risks and vulnerabilities from all natural hazards, including flooding, and then they develop long-term strategies for protecting people and property from future events. Mitigation plans are an investment strategy for that state, tribe, or local government towards disaster resilience. These plans are a prerequisite for being eligible for FEMA mitigation grants and other FEMA post-disaster assistance, as well as other non-FEMA assistance. So these plans are a gateway to a lot of funding, and they are reviewed by the state, and then they're approved by FEMA, generally when it's not a program administration by state. And we have two plan covers here as examples of local plans, and you'll hear more about them later in the webinar from my co-presenters. And the community rating system is a voluntary incentive program that recognizes and encourages community floodplain management activities that exceed the minimum NFIP requirements. Under the CRS, flood insurance premiums for properties are reduced to reflect the flood protection activities in that participating community. So a community receives a CRS classification based on credit points earned for its activities. The CRS has 19 activities. Each have several elements. There could be 1, 2 to 13 elements that provide credit points. One of those 19 activities is Activity 510, Floodplain Management Planning. Many CRS communities rely on their mitigation plan updates for Activity 510 credit. While there are many overlaps between mitigation planning and CRS requirements, they're really, very similar because they're, planning process, but the structure of the requirements may be a little bit different. So knowing those differences and addressing them from the beginning allows a community to maximize the CRS credits being earned from the mitigation plan and other mitigation planning related activities. CRS provides a financial incentive for doing sound floodplain management and good planning. So let's look at the national perspective. CRS communities are, where they are spread. On the left are the different CRS classes, and the discount that they receive in flood insurance ranges from 5% for Class 9 communities to 45% for a Class 1 community. There are only 2 Class 1 communities in the nation. So from the bottom to the top, as you go towards the higher classes, the discount in the flood insurance is increasing, and basically it's based on doing a variety of activities. And it's not just the number of the total points, but it's also the type of activities and prerequisites needed for the higher classes. So higher class activities are doing a range of floodplain management activities, a broad range of activities. And let's look at the national map for the mitigation planning program. Nearly 84% of the nation's population lives in these communities. So it's a, more broader coverage. The CRS is an incentive program. This is more of a, everyone has a plan would be great, so that there's at least some sort of minimal or basic level of understanding of risks and developing mitigation strategies. All states, 5 territories, over 25,000 local governments, and over 200 tribal governments have current plans. So there is a huge opportunity for integrating these processes as the number of communities with local mitigation plan grows, and the number of CRS participating communities that want to improve their CRS classes may also be a good number. So there's a huge opportunity in increasing, in integrating these processes. And then let's look at the comparison of how many points are possible under the 5-10 activity that I talked about, floodplain management planning, and how many points on average, a hazard mitigation plan earns. That's in the rightmost column. So basically, the total number of points is way less. Like a lot of communities are missing out on a lot of points. And where are they missing out the points? If you see the ones that have the biggest gaps, those are critical aspects of any planning process. Public involvement, understanding where the risks are, and implementing the plan. So this is a problem worth solving. It's not just a numbers gap. It's not really, only trying to maximize your credit under CRS. It's really making it a better planning process through the incentive that is already there in the CRS incentive program. And you'll hear more from my colleague Shanine about these 3 aspects later in the presentation. And you'll also hear about how many steps you can match. This is the 10-step planning process, the 10 steps that CRS lists in the 5-10 activity. And so you'll hear more about that also from Wetlands Watch. All right. Wanted to mention that a good resource is in the local planning handbook. We have this crosswalk that goes over for each mitigation planning element, the corresponding CRS activity step. And it also points out the commonly missed element and why, why that step may be missed in the CRS. So check this out. It's in the local planning handbook that's been updated last year, 2023. Okay, and with that, I want to make another policy-related point. Is the timing of this webinar is also part of the why. This integrating these processes idea has been around, but we've tried to help by aligning the requirements a little as much as we could within our regulations. When we've updated the policies last year, they became effective last year, April of 2023. And here's how. In the planning process, the nonprofits are now listed as a separate category of stakeholders that must be involved. So this is really helping to include community-based organizations that represent the underserved populations, and it also helps alignment with CRS. CRS is incentivizing non-governmental members on the planning team. There are points for that. So because that's an incentive program, it's incentivizing, good planning practice. Same for capability assessment. We have added, we've really, detailed out that continued compliance with NFIP piece, that requirement. And we've explained that administration of the NFIP includes managing substantial improvement and substantial damage properties. So that's an important part. And then for that, if you do have a plan for managing substantial improvement and substantial damage, you get points under 5-10 planning step 10, or separately as a new addendum to the CRS manual that awards points for the substantial damage plan. That plan could then tie into the mitigation plan, and that way you're getting CRS credit and you're doing the continued compliance that's required under mitigation planning's capability assessment. And then lastly, the mitigation strategy has separated out as a sub-element the identifying and analysis of mitigation actions. The analysis of alternatives needs to be met separately. It was always there, the word was always there in the regulation, but now separating it out really encourages communities to look at all types of actions, not just structural projects, but regulations, higher standards, natural systems protection, for better preparing communities for the future, including climate impacts. So from the CRS point of view, this is the most often missed step in mitigation plans, the alternatives, mitigation analysis, and describing them in the plan. So those are the ways the updated mitigation planning policy, the local one, is aligning better with the CRS. And that's why we're talking to you today. Hopefully you're able to get helpful tips from this webinar and apply it to your local and state mitigation programs. And to just really wrap up the tips, identify and document the CRS communities early in the planning process. Know the overlaps and differences between the programs and the structure of the requirements. And with every 5-year update, there is an opportunity to advance the work you've done previously. So if you're interested in increasing this integration and getting more and participating in the CRS or increasing your CRS class, then when you're updating the scope, when you're updating your plan and you're scoping it out, that is the best time to kind of bake this integration into your plan update, because most plans are update in the country at this time. So with that, I have wrapped up what I wanted to say. Please put your questions in the Q&A pod, and with that, I'll turn it over to the next poll.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Shubha. So as Shubha mentioned, we do have another question we're actually going to ask you right now, and then we'll move on to our next presentation. So simple prompt here: does your community participate in CRS? And Shubha, we did, of course, get a few questions come in as you were presenting. So we'll, like I said, we'll try to hold those as much as we can until the end. But certainly some good questions there. So we'll have that for the Q&A period at the end.
Kevin, would you like us to start? I'm sorry, your audio is really faint.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry about that. So yeah, so just to kind of level set here with the prompt about communities participating in CRS, 57% yes, 24% no, and almost 20% don't know. So with that, yes, Mary Carson, please take it away. Sorry about that.
No, my apologies. Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you all are located. My name is Mary Carson Stiff. I'm the Executive Director of Wetlands Watch, and Savannah Newbern and I are going to be presenting this information to you today collaboratively. So we were asked to present on the ways in which coastal Virginia communities have integrated the hazard mitigation planning process and the community rating system. And we are doing this in our role as a technical advisor and CRS expert in Virginia. So Wetlands Watch, we're a nonprofit. We're based in Norfolk, Virginia, but we work statewide and beyond on a lot of different issues that are at the intersection of where land, communities, and water meet. And we are trying to work on solutions that incorporate nature to problems and impacts associated with climate change. Most notably in our region, the climate stressors are sea level rise and increased precipitation. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the unique stats for our region and southeastern Virginia. But things are bad down here. And so we are constantly thinking about ways in which we can leverage existing relationships and work on establishing new relationships to create innovative solutions to this growing problem. Wetlands Watch, as a nonprofit, we really think of ourselves as a boundary organization. You can see here on the screen, the role of a boundary organization is to kind of pass information back and forth between producers and users. And we often find ourselves in the producer category as well as the user category, which makes us a really good boundary organization because we understand the perspectives of both producers and users. So the way that we do this in the floodplain management space is to provide a lot of technical information and hosting of collaborations and of partnerships that amplify the messages of strong floodplain management, which helps build community resilience. And that resilience can be both physical as well as social resilience. We are deeply entrenched in the National Flood Insurance Program and the community rating system in ways that may not be obvious to many of our friends and partners, and especially with our name Wetlands Watch. But we know that local governments are at the front lines of climate change and of flood risk reduction, and that the National Flood Insurance Program, through its regulatory function as well as its flood insurance provision function, is setting the standard for the way in which local governments change land use, strengthen land use, and reduce the impacts of flooding. As it turns out, the community rating system is the only program that allows for the straight up monetization of wetlands protection and shoreline buffer protection. There's no other program in America that does it. And so it's money for governments to protect against developing our natural resources. So this is just a win-win-win program for our organization to promote. Savannah, if you want to advance to the next slide. The way in which we do this boundary organization work is through the chairmanship or womanship of the Virginia CRS work group. This is our user group. We decided to modify the name from user group to work group because we really wanted buy-in from our members to actually engage in the creation of products that others can use to benefit their communities. We meet in person and virtually every other month. The virtual option was already being provided prior to COVID, but certainly became incredibly important during COVID. The blue dots on the screen show our participation geographically. We have a little bit more participation in the western part of the state that's occurred since this image was taken, but we do have a wide variety of stakeholders that are all across the state, not just in the coastal zone. I think there are a couple more. So what we do is we talk about best practices. We talk about ways in which communities can increase their CRS participation and can not just excel in the CRS program, but what does it take to actually join? So our members are not just CRS communities. We have participation from all really all of our NFIP participating communities statewide. So we talk a lot about what it takes to actually be enrolled, what it takes to maintain your participation. And we try to bring in some solutions to address some of those capacity challenges. And I already saw a question in the chat that gets at exactly what our organization tries to do, talk to communities about whether or not it makes sense to join. So our community of practice is where we get a lot of our information and way in which we stay involved with our local government partners and stakeholders. And if you want to go ahead and advance to the next slide, please. There's been some helpful background that Shubha provided that I'm not going to reiterate. We know, and what we're here to really talk about is that coastal Virginia communities with increasing with an increasing kind of participation, are using the hazard mitigation plans to earn CRS credits in Activity 510. This is a phenomenon that started many years ago with our first plan getting credited down in Hampton Roads. But we're seeing this trend increase as more communities are becoming aware of the all of the wonderful co-benefits. We're also seeing that the hazard mitigation plan in this regional context can be successful across other programs, not just the CRS program. And so that's also increasing the popularity of this option. And I just wanted to say that, one of the reasons why this is working so well in Virginia is that we have units of government, quasi-government, called planning district commissions. Virginia has 21 in total, and these are voluntary associations made up of local governments that are working, it's staff that are hired and funded by all of the local governments, and they're kind of acting as their voice in planning and in other regional issues. And so this structure is really essential, I think, to the success of this model, because it's already providing this regional network for our local governments to buy in. They already pay in a contract relationship to pay for staff, and so to bring in a consultant to do this work is no big deal because they already have the procurement process and the payment process in place. But then it also is a usual relationship where local government staff are used to coming together around the table and talking about projects and plans that have a regional focus. So it's old hat to a lot of these staff, which makes the 10-step process less of a big deal. So go ahead, Savannah is going to take you through the next several slides.
Hi, I'm Savannah Newbern, just to reiterate, and I work with Wetlands Watch. And today I'm going to be going over 3 local examples in coastal Virginia of regional hazard mitigation plans that incorporated the 10-step process, starting with the Hampton Roads. And just for some background on the Hampton Roads, this area is subject to one of the highest rates of sea level rise and land subsidence on the East Coast. So this program is especially vital, and pre-disaster mitigation is, invaluable. This PDC is home to 11 CRS communities with over 62,000 policyholders, totaling $18 billion in coverage. Their plan was adopted in 2022, and this was the language that was used when scoping for the plan. So they had included in their RFP to assist the HRPDC and participating communities to ensure the CRS requirements are met during the planning process. And it goes into great detail about how that was to be accomplished, both in assisting to ensure the CRS requirements are met, determining local jurisdiction CRS planning goals so that the CRS compliant public outreach, agency contacts, and final mitigation actions may be appropriately managed throughout the planning process. It specified that they were to provide templates and other materials to encourage community actions that may result in additional CRS point accumulation. And the work plan and final document will include CRS creditable elements and meet, those minimum requirements for credit. So they went into great detail in that RFP, and as a result, this plan was the gold standard for scoring for hazard mitigation plans in Virginia. So this grant was funded, the HMP process was funded through a grant from FEMA, but in this case, it specified that the CRS program was not to be included, so the HRPDC had to find an additional source of funding, which meant that there were 2 separate consultants involved in the process, one that prepared the plan and one that prepared the final checklist. And we'll go over that a little bit more later. Moving on to Plan RVA and Crater Planning District Commission. This was a combination of two planning district commissions working together for a multi-regional hazard mitigation plan. In this multi-regional hazard mitigation plan, there were only 3 CRS participating communities. Henrico County is going to become effective later this year, which totaled 1,500 flood insurance policyholders and $500 million in coverage across those 3 CRS communities. And again, this hazard mitigation plan was also prepared in 2022. So in the RFP that was put out, and this is the language shared with us by Plan RVA, the regional commission for that area, the plan must meet the federal mitigation planning requirements, and they included in their language both the FEMA and the CRS compliance all in one place. So it's a really easy lift to add that to your RFP. You already have a spot in mind, so it wouldn't be difficult. Specifically, they said the plan should conform to the community rating system within the National Flood Insurance Program, and the contractor will put in place a protocol that establishes the ability for member jurisdictions to meet CRS credit requirements associated with the hazard mitigation planning process. You can see that this language was not quite as detailed as the Hampton Roads PDC's language. And as a result of that, or in correlation, this plan scored about midway in terms of the higher scoring plans in Virginia. Next, we're going to look at the Northern Virginia Regional Commission, which was home to 6 participating communities. You can see that this bumps up against DC. It's a very highly developed area. And so among those 6 communities, there's over 9,000 policyholders, totaling $2.2 billion in coverage. So in their RFP, the scoping process, they included the language that there are several CRS communities within Northern Virginia. The plan update will ensure that existing CRS communities will be able to fulfill 510 credit requirements, as well as providing the foundation for any community that wishes to join in the future. Among the plans that we've shared so far, the scoping process for this was the least detailed. And when we discussed this with the PDC, they said that for future use, they would prefer to include language like the second bullet here that ensures plan compliance with all relevant CRS requirements, including but not limited to receiving full credit for activity 510. And I did just want to highlight that multiple times activity 510 was reiterated across the scoping language, but this is specifically element 512A, the CRS 10-step process that is getting these credits. So to summarize, here is the scoring of the 3 plans that we took a look at. The 2022 HRPDC plan scored 302 points out of the possible 384. It was a really great plan for the state of Virginia. And the language that they included that was so heavily detailed really mirrors the effort that was put in and the knowledge that was required of the consultant to make sure that the hazard mitigation planning process complied with that CRS 10-step floodplain planning process as well. So going over some of the limitations of the hazard mitigation plans that were prepared and scored, these plans are inherently less specific than locality scale plans, and the projects that are highlighted within them are intentionally vague to increase access to funding. So some communities may consider preparing locality scale plans. However, they cannot receive the CRS 10-step credit for both plans. They would have to scrap the credit from the regional plan, and only credit from their local plan would be scored. So among the lessons that were learned during this process for the PDCs was to be really clear in coordinating and using language when scoping to say who is responsible for completing the CRS 10-step checklist upon completion of the plan. Will it be the locality staff, the PDC staff, or the consultant? That person can speak directly with the CRS specialist that will be coordinating the scoring of the plan, and it makes it a much simpler process for the CRS participating localities in the region if there is a point person managing that back and forth. And we already spoke to making sure that you're getting credit for 512A and not activity 510 generally. So in the same way that Shuba had gone over what often a lot of PDCs or regional hazard mitigation plans are leaving on the table in terms of scoring is, those steps that were discussed between us and our CRS specialist here in Virginia that people often leave out are specifically step 5C, which is repetitive loss analysis, and then step 7, which is assessing mitigation activities. So if step 5C is missed, communities with 50 or more rep loss area properties are then needing to do their own repetitive loss area analysis. And that's where a community has to look at every single structure in the rep loss area, review all damaged buildings and flood insurance claims, and do a curbside assessment with an outreach component. Or they'll have to redo the hazard mitigation plan at the locality scale, because that is now a prerequisite for communities with more than 50 rep loss properties. And just to reiterate that it's so important for the CRS communities that are comprising the regions that the hazard mitigation plans are taking place, that they know what's required at the start, middle, and end of the process, and that they can benefit from cross-pollinating some of their efforts in floodplain management by incorporating their PPI committee and their floodplain management committee to get maximum credits for, because they can double up. Now I'm going to turn it over to Mary Carson.
One thing that are a couple of things that we've just seen change in the past, I want to say 10 years since our community started to really take advantage of the ability to receive these credits for the regional hazard mitigation plans. Impacts of climate stressors have increased to such a degree that our communities are starting to have to plan very hyper locally. And that change has meant that often some of the hazard mitigation planning that's occurred isn't sufficient enough to give the local government access to grant funding and resources beyond those that are accessible through the FEMA process when you do a hazard mitigation plan. So it's about access to funding, and it's also about planning for events, planning for future projects that are maybe smaller in scale and really need to be specific and less vague, which is definitely, a really important way in which communities can ensure that they get access to funding when a big storm hits or when a big bucket of funding like BRIC is available. So what we're seeing is that communities are adopting far more localized plans, and it's unclear whether or not they're going to start opting to submit their localized plans for activity 510C, I think that's the right credit or not. But it's certainly something that's been discussed a little bit here and there in our regional work group and in some of our climate change adaptation planning conversations. We're also seeing that outside entities are driving the interest for these very hyper local plans. We have a new state grant program that was made possible because of Virginia's participation in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and our governor's pulling us out of that program, but that's a completely other story. But this new grant program is requiring that local floodplain management plans are created to allow for local governments to access project funding. And so the requirements for these plans are far more far more detailed, far more explicit than the hazard mitigation plans. And so our communities are adopting these local floodplain management plans, and they're often kind of tagging on maybe a flood insurance assessment to be able to get credits through the CRS program for that action, or they're trying to do a green infrastructure plan, which would allow them to get credit under another CRS section. So our communities are very driven by wanting to succeed in the CRS program and to layer the benefits, but we're just seeing less and less deference to our hazard mitigation plans and more deference to hyper localized planning. So something that we're watching carefully in the CRS space, but then also, this is way bigger than, are we getting CRS credit or not? This is about, can we access billions of dollars for projects that we need to protect us against storms, to protect us against the impacts of recurrent flooding and nuisance flooding and all that stuff that's just dominating our lives here in coastal Virginia.
And so as you're thinking about preparing your hazard mitigation plan scoping document or your RFP, you might want to keep the things that we have discussed in mind. And some resources for that would be the checklist, of course, so that you can know what to expect will be necessary to make sure all elements that have been included in the planning process and the preparation of your document are getting credit. Another thing to keep in mind is that after you complete your plan, you hear back from your CRS specialist about your score. That doesn't mean that you're done with your plan. You still have to annually reevaluate it and submit that progress report template at your recertification visit to make sure that you're maintaining those credits. Additionally, there is so much else on the table when it comes to Activity 510. If your community has the appetite for it, there are 762 points total in Activity 510 now since the 2021 addendum to the manual. Most exciting with the addendum, there was the new substantial damage management plan that can earn your community 140 points for credit if you establish a detailed plan that will, say what your community will do before or after a flood or other hazardous event, describing the community's process for evaluating damage to buildings and addressing those that have been substantially damaged. This can also be done to take into account other sources of damage. Like if your community is not as susceptible to flooding, you can utilize this opportunity to discuss tornadoes, earthquakes, hurricanes, and wildfires as well. And you'll still tick those scoring boxes. Additionally, you can pursue natural functions floodplain planning, like a green infrastructure plan, a floodplain species protection plan, and all of those could garner your community those additional points that help push you up a class threshold. So thank you guys for listening. We're going to save our questions for the end, but if you'd like to reach out to Mary Carson or I directly with any questions, here is our contact information. After this, we're going to turn it over to Shanine Thomas. Mary Carson, did you have any other comments?
Nope. Thanks for letting us participate.
All right, Kevin, you're going to pull up that poll question for us.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Mary Carson. Thank you, Savannah. I am going to, we have another question for you all, the audience. So bear with me for just a moment while I get that opened. Okay, it should be open now. So go ahead and read through that, take a moment to respond. And in the meantime, I just wanted to mention we do have several questions, some really good questions. So we are going to hold those until the end. I want to make sure Shanine has enough time to present, but some of your questions have been answered in writing. Shuba's been in there, and some other people have been in there answering questions. So if you have a question that you asked early on, it may have a response. So go ahead and look back in the Q&A area and see if your question has a response. Like I said, we'll keep some for the end as well. And then any ones that are outstanding, we'll try to get back to you after the fact. But I'm going to wrap up the poll in just a few seconds, and we'll take a look at the results. So pretty evenly distributed across the board.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Kevin. So we see a lot of you have included the 10-step process into your hazard mitigation plan as well. And looks like you're receiving some of these CRS credits for those activities. So to get started here on this side, we're going to look at a case study from a Class 1 community, the city of Tulsa, and just give you a little background information on some of the activities that they have incorporated on a larger scale, and then go into how the state can support the local communities within their area to increase their CRS activities points. So first up, we have the city of Tulsa, and here you see a graphic to where a lot of development was done between the years of 1900 all the way up to 1952 on the right. And Tulsa's flood history, it legitimately has started around the time early 1900s as we opened up the land rush areas, and it's also along the route commonly known as Route 66. So you had a lot of settlers who would come in and set up homestead there. So with that increased development over the years, you also found oil, which also increased the development, as well as other economic endeavors. So the city of Tulsa, it sits on the Arkansas River, which is a major river in the United States. And it also has a dam that was constructed, the Keystone Dam. So although the dam was constructed to help with some of the flood control issues that they were experiencing, it did not eliminate any of those flood issues. So you compile that with the development and the rapid growth within the area. And then at the time, this is pre-NFIP, so pre-National Flood Insurance Program in 1978. There's a lot of risk here that weren't necessarily considered when the community was developing. So this led to a period of time where you had a 15-year disaster history where there were 9 federally declared disasters within the Tulsa area. And that has since been reduced, but most recently we had a flood of 2021 that also showed some issues there, but it did show a reduction in a lot of the individual assistance claims that come from homeowners, as well as a reduction in like road closures, etc. So there's a lot of progress that have been made over time within the city of Tulsa. So looking into some of these CRS activities, overall, as a Class 1 community, the city of Tulsa has a variety of activities that they implement. So you're looking at a collaborative approach that is not just one entity within the city that looks into floodplain management. It's not just one entity within the city of Tulsa that's concerned about the outcomes of flooding and those impacts. So they have looked into higher standards, which includes higher ordinance requirements, other ordinance and regulatory requirements, emergency planning across the board, not just the flooding hazard, but other hazards as well. They have a robust warning and communication system, as well as their substantial damage determinations, as Savannah mentioned earlier about having a plan that specifically identifies which communities and which areas are vulnerable to flooding, making sure that those repetitive loss properties are addressed as well. And then any areas that repetitively flood, looking at how to provide a solution in those areas. Because many of the areas in Tulsa have been bought out. So some of those properties that were homes, the properties were acquired. Some areas that have now been turned into parks and recreational components have been, sustained for green space for the inception. So it's not just one piece, it's not just one factor. And we talk about the 510 series as it pertains to hazard mitigation planning. But when you look at the Class 1 community of Tulsa, it goes beyond just the 500 and 510 series. It incorporates the 300 series, which includes public education, as well as mapping and regulatory, which is your activities under 400. So just think about if you're wanting to increase your CRS rating, that you can look into more than just the hazard mitigation planning requirements as they relate to the CRS activities, but you can also bring these activities into your hazard mitigation plan, of which the city of Tulsa did. They also make long-term investments. So you want to look at how you can incorporate your development and your redevelopment into your hazard mitigation plan when you are looking at how the hazards perform, not just the flood hazard, but all other hazards that may be impacting the area, and make decisions based off of what the community can sustain. So we would definitely hate to see a community to get maximum points or more points for certain activities, and then those, as the community grows or as the community changes and leadership has changed, that those investments change. And when those investments change, you can put yourself at risk for losing those points after you have previously acquired those points. So you want to think more long-term and make sure that it's sustainable when it comes to your community and your community needs. And then that leads into the managing those capabilities. So say, for instance, if you are looking into activities that require a certain level of expertise and you can't sustain that expertise level, or you can't sustain that practice originally, when you come up on your recertification, those points would be reduced. And then if there's enough points that are reduced, then you have to manage expectations as well, because your community members may see that, hey, I was getting a certain percentage of a discount, and now that you cannot maintain these activities, we can't continue to get that same level of a discount. So those are some things that definitely Tulsa in general, they take in consideration when they're implementing these activities, and the communities within your areas should take those same level of expectations and considerations. So to break down a few of the activities that the city of Tulsa has received points for, when it comes to the CRS activities under 510, they do receive points for the 10-step planning process. They have an extremely robust planning team. So it includes not only your general like land management components, but they have such a robust planning team when it comes to the hazard mitigation plan that reaches across not only the public sector, the private sector, and including the government within their area, as well as some of the surrounding communities. Their public involvement is also a piece that they receive the activities for. So they don't just use one level or one type of public involvement. So many of the hazard mitigation plans that we receive here in Region 6, they may only post the public component for hazard mitigation plans and their involvement on a website, or they may only do like a flyer or something like that. So the city of Tulsa has a multitude of public involvement options when it comes to getting hazard criteria, hazard data, as well as some of the solutions to meeting the needs of the community. Their structural data as well it's extremely robust. It has some engineering data behind it. Not all of it is included specifically in the hazard mitigation plan, but it is referenced, and they talk about how they acquire the structural data, looking at the age of structures, as well as building codes and how they can implement stronger codes, higher codes, as well as standards. And then as previously mentioned, we've talked a lot about mitigation activities and having a variety. The city of Tulsa as well has a variety of mitigation activities, from low cost activities all the way up to activities that may require a grant from another funding source. So some of the other activities that the city of Tulsa has implemented that they receive credit for are like watershed plans. And so the city of Tulsa has a couple of watersheds that they are in. So you have to think about, on a watershed planning level, it is not just one community, it is multiple communities that feed into this watershed. So that also brings up a collaborative effort as well that reverts back to that planning team and that robust planning team. They have a multitude of elevation and flood proofing ordinances based on where the hazard is. So it's not necessarily an equivalent across the city. There are some subdivisions that have a little higher standards than others, as well as different types of flood mitigation and requirements there. They have stormwater detention, and their stormwater detention plan is it allows for the community to look to see where the water is flowing, and then any development takes in strong consideration about the stormwater detention and where it's going to flow. When it comes to their flood preparedness activities, there's a number of flood preparedness activities that range from public education all the way up to incorporating other hazards, as well as activities that you might do for other hazards that could also reduce the impacts of flooding. And then, as you see to the right of the screen here, they have an online risk assessment tool that's available that incorporates not only the public involvement component for activities, but also a risk assessment component. So you've got two pieces here where you're engaging the community as well as providing data to the community with the Map My House risk assessment tool. This tool it does not only focus on flooding. You have high wind tornado, there's dam and levees, there's some wildfire information in there as well, which allows them to request additional points in other activity areas. And then, as mentioned, they have that non-structural mitigation and that acquisition list that is very robust to see whether or not they need to acquire property, or if they need to provide elevation or other types of flood proofing in the area. So switching gears now to discuss some of the state support. Shuba mentioned earlier and showed this particular graphic, and then we've talked a little bit with Mary Carson and Savannah about the points and the maximum points when it comes to the 510 activities. So here you're looking at the 10-step planning process and how the points are accumulated across the board. So if you take a look at some of the areas that you have a maximum point criteria here, and then the points that people are actually receiving, some of these areas, there's a large gap. And from a state perspective, the states can support the local communities in getting more points and implementing more activities by, one, just recognizing the fact that there is a gap here. So if you look at the planning process and you're looking at involving the public, there is a maximum points of 120, but the average points within the hazard mitigation plan is only 34. In hazard mitigation planning, there is a huge component with involving the public and how you involve the public. So those point systems can be implemented within the planning process to bridge that gap. That's almost a 100-point gap. So if you're looking at something simple that you could implement, you could look here, and the state can look at pieces that would help involve the public with the local community to bridge that gap within those points. Then if we move on to the risk assessment, and there's still is not that big of a gap, but when you're assessing the problem and you got 52 points, I would think from a hazard mitigation planning perspective that most plans should be getting a maximum points of 52 points rather than 29 points. So you've got, about a little bit more than 20 points that you can incur here to assess the problem. So what are we missing here? Are we not providing enough information in the risk assessment to actually assess the problem? Are we not providing a multi-hazard risk assessment that actually helps meet the requirement? So these are pieces that the state can look at within the hazard mitigation plan to see where we can fill these gaps. And then lastly, if you scroll down to step 10, where you're in your plan maintenance component and the implementation, evaluation, and revising of the hazard mitigation plan, that particular section is oftentimes overlooked, and maybe it's something as simple as, okay, my community will continue to implement the hazard mitigation plan, or will continue to evaluate and revise the plan, but doesn't provide some clear steps and guidance on what you're going to implement into how specifically you're going to evaluate the plan, as well as how specifically the community would revise the plan. So you've got 26 max points here, and most of the communities are only getting 5. So just even with a little tweak there, you could potentially get up to all of the 26 points. So overall, we've mentioned the maximum points for this step 10 process is 382, and then most of the communities total are getting 171. So there's some area for improvement here. And then lastly, one component that the states can do to help support increasing the credit options within the communities is one, to just make the communities aware of the activities and how they can implement the activities themselves, and provide different ideas on how they can implement the activities, as well as going to like your FEMA counterparts as well. We can also help in that area. Then when you're looking at increasing the activity points, you also have to think about what those prerequisites are. So are any of the states that you're in, do they have any components within their local ordinance requirements that would help you meet some of these prerequisites as you move up in classes? If not, the state can look at how they can implement certain factors within these ordinances within the state to increase the prerequisite value, as well as incorporating some of those prerequisites within the ordinance. Then you can discuss the findings with the community. So if you're a state person here and you're looking at, okay, well, how can I help them move forward? So if you see to the right, we do have a snippet from the CRS communities credit file, and the communities names have been replaced with just some community names, community A through L. But if you see, there's a number of classes here, 6, 9, all the way down. And we have a class 1 here listed. So total CRS points is what you would look at and see how many points they're acquiring and they're getting. If they're on the cusp between an activity or another, if they even have enough points to move up to the other activity or the other CRS point level. So if they're moving up to a class level, then is there a prerequisite, first off? And then second, can that community sustain whatever the prerequisite is? And if not, then it might not be a good decision to move up to another class. But if it is, and that community has the buy-in, of course, of the citizens as well as the elected officials, then you can go so far to say, all right, now where should we go within these activities? So we've pointed out some, since this presentation is specifically about the 510 activities, how these communities measure up with those activities. So community A only receives 50 points. So that equates to the fact that they have a plan, but it might not meet all of the criteria under the 510 activities. So that's the minimum points. If you're requesting 510 activity points, if you at least have a mitigation plan, then you can get the 50 points. So if you look higher up to the community L, who is a class 1, they receive 478 points based off of the 510 activities. So what are they doing differently per se from these communities who are only receiving 50 points? And as you implement these activities and determine what processes you can improve on from a state perspective, you can just letting people know. They might not even know that there are things that they're doing within their hazard mitigation plan that could be counted towards CRS activities. So if you look at community C, E, and I, they could very well have a hazard mitigation plan, but during their certification or recertification process, they did not mention that they had a hazard mitigation plan. So to the for them, they may need to just know, hey, you should be saying, I want these points and requesting a certification for those specific points. And then lastly, if your community is doing anything since their recertification and you've gotten some improvements, you need to request that recertification specifically for those points that you're missing. And then when the state implements measures statewide, that's also another way to increase your CRS class activities and their point ratings. So as mentioned here, the state of Oklahoma, it does require freeboard in their standard NFIP ordinance. So that already helps a community go from class 9 or class 10 to class 9. And with that, we have one last slide. And this is all the resources we've talked about today from the FEMA perspective. So Shuba did mention the hazard mitigation handbook, so the local handbook, which contains the mitigation planning and CRS crosswalk to help communities compare the two and focus on those activities to obtain the maximum points. We also have a key topics bulletin, and we have 2 policies that have been updated, the local mitigation planning policy guide, as well as the state mitigation planning policy guide. And then of course, some resources that are available on FEMA.gov. So the community rating system resources, as well as some case studies and fact sheets. So with that, here's our last slide with all of our contact information. Feel free to take a screenshot of that, but with this presentation will also be available and sent to you all after the webinar. So I will turn it over to Kevin for question and answer.
Thank you very much. This is Alan. Kevin has a bit of audio issues, so I'm going to handle the questions. And I believe people can see the open questions and the answered questions. So if you had a question and it was answered, it'd be in the answered column. And but there are a couple open questions here that I think are useful. And one question, and it seems to be, and that's the impact on race grading 2.0 on the CRS program. Is that has that had an impact on CRS? And that's been in place now for a while, and I know there's been a lot of discussion about risk rating 2.0, and was curious if you have any comments on that.
I added a brief response in the Q&A section to that question, just noting that in Virginia, we're seeing the same level of interest in the CRS, and our participation rates continue to grow, but we're not seeing the race to join that we did after the Biggert Waters and Grimm Waters legislation just kind of changed everything for flood insurance. Because risk rating 2.0 is the equity and action component is dropping some rates right away. I think that that's been helpful. And in Virginia, we were fortunate in that it was almost split 50-50 in increases versus immediate decreases. And so that's buffered some of the chaos around increased rates. But we anticipate in about 3 to 5 years, we'll really know what's up with how the rates will continue to increase as people go on their glide paths. And the only thing that makes people join the CRS program is when policyholders are angry about the costs. And so we'll see. I think that the the best thing about risk rating 2.0 for the CRS program is that it used to be the case that only policyholders located in the highest risk flood zones or special flood hazard areas were eligible to receive the discount. And now under risk rating 2.0, everyone in the community is allowed to receive the discount. Even if you have a preferred risk policy because you're outside of those zones and you don't have to carry flood insurance. And so it was a great equalizer for the CRS program. And we had communities that felt as though that said, we cannot join because it's not fair, because only those people that live in the highest flood risk zones are able to receive the benefit. And so that political barrier came down, and that has helped communities that were hesitant because of their county board of supervisors didn't want to join because not everybody could get the benefit. So there are two different things that are happening, and one is really good, and one could be good for participation, just maybe not good for policyholders.
That was very interesting because I've always wondered about that myself. So thank you for that answer. And another question that's in here says from a multi-hazard point of view in risk assessment, are tidal flooding, coastal storm surge, and precipitation flooding considered multiple hazards, or do they count as one flooding hazard and we would need to include another hazard such as fire extreme to gain extra points?
Shuba, do you want to take that one?
Go ahead if you want to answer.
Okay, I will take a stab at it. So ultimately, when it comes to how you receive the points is based on the person who's reviewing and reviewing your activities. But from a hazard mitigation planning perspective, it could go both ways. So we have some communities that profile their flooding, both riverine flooding and their development flooding or their groundwater flooding or drainage type flooding. And then also some that will profile separately their coastal flooding. So I'm thinking maybe if the source is slightly different, then maybe that reviewer would count that as multi-hazard, but you might not receive the maximum points. So in order to receive the maximum points, you would want to tie in anything like wildfire or tornado if you all have it, or landslide, expansive soil, any of those other types of hazards.
Okay, great. Thank you. Here's a comment, it seems, that says some CRS communities are not seeing the rate benefits due to, quote, grandfathering in. It says the formula hurts residents trying to keep their homes. Guess does anybody have a comment on that?
Yeah, I wasn't sure quite what this comment meant. Risk rating 2.0 is getting rid of grandfathering. So I don't know if others had a reaction to that.
Yeah, we don't work on the point criteria side as far as how they receive points and like if something is grandfathered in. So Shuba or I would not know the answer to that.
Okay.
I would
I'm-
just add, oh, go ahead, Savannah.
I was just going to ask a clarification question to the person who submitted the question, if they meant that it was the flood insurance policy that was grandfathered or if it was the structure itself. Because if the structure had been grandfathered in some way, then it may be considered minus rated and not receiving the discounts of the CRS program.
Okay, another question here. I'll wait to see if they add something. But if a community wants to maximize credit in CRS step 10, then the planning committee would need to meet more often. Credit is for often the community meets after the plan is adopted.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
that's more of a comment. Thank you, David. I know you review plans, and so you're adding that it's the implementation time after the mitigation plan is done, or the floodplain management plan is done after adoption. If you keep meeting, if the committee continues to meet, there are points for CRS step 10 in that. So if one of us misspoke, sorry about that. But you've been providing more clarification. That's great. And then you've also provided clarification that for step 5, credit is based on flood hazard in the risk assessment. If the flood hazard section is not robust or does not address the criteria, the credit is reduced. Yeah, thank you, David. Maybe we'll just answer so everyone can see it in the answered queue.
Sure. And then we got another one from Walter, Zone X with the preferred risk policy of $400 a year, going to $5,000 a year with 2.0. So CRS discount is not going to make a difference. Is that what the comment is?
Yeah, I think that people are pretty frustrated that the preferred risk policy rates are seeing increases where they have typically been steady and $500 a pop. And with risk rating 2.0, preferred risk policies are no longer available, and they're generally more expensive. However, the $5,000 jump should not happen because of the congressionally mandated caps on annual increases. And it's an 18% cap for primary residences and a 25% cap for secondary homes, businesses, and I think severe repetitive loss properties. So I'm not sure of that example, but certainly if that example is real, then someone needs to talk to their insurance company and push back on that, because it's not allowed to be that big of a jump.
And then there's a comment here, and it's one I've heard before. It says, has anyone looked into creating incentive, such as coughing up some funding for capacity building for communities who are in good standing in the NFIP and also have hazard mitigation plans and want to become CRS communities, but lack the capability to go the extra mile to do the CRS activities? I guess the basic comment to that is we've heard that comment for a long time, and generally it does take some initial effort on the community's part without funding to get the ball rolling.
Yeah, and I would encourage looking into the planning related activities that are available under HMGP, and they're really called planning and planning related activities under BRIC, CNCB activities that have integration with the planning processes and that sort of funding for additional planning activities related to the mitigation plan, but reaching out, you could be integrating your plan with recovery planning or floodplain management planning, or so that's what it would fall under. So I would explore that type of funding, planning related activities. And I would also point that FMA program, Shandy put in a comment, and I put thanks for the comment, so it shows up in the answered one, that FMA also has a capability and capacity activity for jurisdictions to develop repetitive loss and substantial damage strategies and plans.
Yeah, and I would add just ultimately the activities that a community invests in, that the sustainability of those activities based on those local capabilities is very key.
Okay, well, we're getting down to time. Kevin, is it time to do your final slides, or we have a time for a couple more questions?
Yes, we're just about at time. I hope my audio is okay. I'm sort of like tentatively trying to get back into this here, but yes, we're just about at time. So a lot of great questions were answered in writing, during the event. So again, if you had a question, go back and check that answered area. And we'll sort of synthesize that as best we can and include that as one of the resources we send out. But in the meantime, we do have just like a simple rating. We want you all to weigh in with to see how we did today. So I'm going to give everybody a minute to just sort of respond and rate our webinar today. Yeah, but so while I leave that open and running for people to think about and respond to, last thing I just want to mention is basically the sort of promised follow-up from today. It'll all hopefully come within contained rather within one email, probably a week from today. So look out for that on Wednesday, potentially maybe into Thursday, depending on how things go. But that's going to have your certificate of attendance. That's going to have a link to the recording and slides. And I believe, of course, with it contained within the slides, there's lots of links to different resources. And I think we'll have some different attachments for you in that email as well. So it's going to have a ton of information, but it is going to take us about a week to process all that. So just wanted to hopefully let everybody know, be patient, and we will certainly be getting back to you. But as Alan mentioned, we're at time. So thank you very much to all our presenters for taking the time out of your afternoons to present to us. And thank you all as attendees for joining us and participating and sending in your questions and comments. It's always really appreciated. So we do these quarterly. We hope to see you next time. But until then, thank you so much. Have a great rest of your week, everybody. Take care.